He thought he had found the perfect joke for the night, but he had no idea he had just invited a legend back into the light. The kind of legend that doesn't announce itself, the kind that lets the world reveal its mistakes slowly, painfully, and in complete silence, the kind that turns laughter into something people wish they could take back. And that night in a modest town hall just off Maple Street, under dim stage lights that buzzed faintly overhead, Jason Cole stood at center stage with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled the room, his polished shoes reflecting the cheap glow of the overhead bulbs as he scanned the audience for his next moment, his next viral clip, his next easy laugh. Because to him, this wasn't just a talent show. It was content. It was numbers. It was attention. And when his eyes landed on her, sitting quietly in the third row near the aisle, hands folded neatly over a worn handbag, posture straight but unassuming, dressed in a simple beige cardigan and a long skirt that looked decades old, he saw exactly what he thought he needed: an easy target, a harmless joke, a moment the crowd would eat up without question. Margaret Hale didn't look like someone who belonged under stage lights. She looked like someone who had come to watch, maybe to pass time, maybe out of habit, maybe because quiet evenings had become too quiet, and that was enough for him. More than enough. Because people like her, in his mind, existed on the edges of stories, not at the center of them. And so with a grin that spread just a little too wide, he leaned into the microphone and called her out, his voice smooth but edged with amusement as he said they needed a volunteer, someone brave, someone fun, someone unexpected. And before she could even fully process what was happening, the spotlight shifted, slow and deliberate, until it rested on her, turning her into the center of attention she never asked for. And the room reacted exactly as he expected: a ripple of laughter, a few whispers, phones already lifting to record what they assumed would be awkward, harmless entertainment. And for a moment, Margaret didn't move, her eyes lifting gently toward the stage, not startled, not offended, just observing, as if she had seen something like this before, as if she understood something the rest of the room didn't. And Jason, mistaking her stillness for hesitation, pushed a little further, joking that maybe she had a hidden talent, maybe she could sing for them, maybe she'd surprise everyone, his tone playful but pointed, the kind that invites the audience to laugh along without ever questioning why. And slowly, almost carefully, Margaret rose from her seat, the fabric of her skirt brushing softly against the chair as she stepped into the aisle, the sound barely audible beneath the murmurs of the crowd. And as she began to walk toward the stage, something subtle shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in the space around her, in the steadiness of her steps, in the quiet way she held herself, as if this wasn't unfamiliar ground, as if the stage ahead wasn't a place of humiliation, but something else entirely, something remembered. And for the first time that night, though no one could quite explain why, a few people stopped laughing, just for a second, just long enough to feel that something about this moment wasn't going to unfold the way they expected. And Jason, still smiling, still confident, stepped aside to welcome her up, unaware that the story he thought he was controlling had already begun to turn against him. The wooden steps creaked softly under Margaret's weight as she made her way onto the stage, each step measured, unhurried, as if she were not climbing into a moment of public amusement, but returning to something long set aside. And the closer she got to the center, the more the room leaned in, not out of respect, not yet, but out of curiosity mixed with quiet judgment, the kind that fills a space without ever being spoken aloud. And Jason gestured toward the microphone with a half-bow that drew another ripple of laughter from the audience, his smile fixed, his eyes scanning the crowd for approval, as if to say, "This is exactly what you came for." And when Margaret reached the microphone, she paused, not awkwardly, not nervously, but with a stillness that did not match the energy of the room, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze lifting just enough to meet the lights before settling forward. And Jason, sensing the moment stretching longer than he intended, leaned back toward her with a playful tone and asked what she would be singing tonight, his voice amplified, his words echoing faintly against the walls. And a few people chuckled again, expecting hesitation, expecting confusion, expecting something easy to laugh at. But Margaret simply looked at him, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were considering a question that deserved more weight than it was given. And then, in a voice that was soft but steady, she said she would prefer to choose her own song. And the room reacted with a mix of surprise and amusement, as though that small request carried more confidence than anyone had anticipated. And Jason raised his eyebrows slightly, playing along, telling her of course she could, stretching the moment for effect, making a show of stepping back and giving her the stage as if it were a generous act. But there was a flicker in his expression now, something subtle, something uncertain, because she had not followed the script he imagined. She had not stumbled, had not apologized, had not asked for guidance. And as a technician near the sound booth adjusted the controls, waiting for a cue that did not come, Margaret took a small breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly. And somewhere in the audience, a man in his late 60s leaned forward in his seat, his brow tightening as he studied her face, as if trying to place a memory that hovered just out of reach. And the murmurs in the room began to soften, not entirely, but enough that the space between sounds grew wider, enough that the hum of the lights above became noticeable, enough that the anticipation, though still wrapped in doubt, began to shift into something else. And Jason, now standing off to the side, folded his arms loosely, still smiling but no longer speaking, waiting for the moment to tip back into comedy, waiting for her to confirm what everyone assumed. But Margaret did not rush. She did not fill the silence with words. She simply stepped a fraction closer to the microphone, her fingers lightly brushing the stand as if grounding herself in something familiar. And in that quiet, in that suspended second where expectation hung in the air, the room began to change, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way a story changes direction before anyone realizes they are no longer watching what they thought they were watching. For a brief second, nothing happened, and that second stretched just long enough for the audience to grow restless again, a few scattered chuckles returning as people shifted in their seats, expecting the moment to collapse back into harmless embarrassment. And somewhere near the back a whisper rose asking if there was even going to be music, while Jason tilted his head slightly with a polite but strained smile, as if silently encouraging her to begin before the room lost interest completely. But Margaret did not react to any of it. She simply closed her eyes, not in hesitation but in focus, as though the noise around her had already faded into something distant and unimportant. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a single note that slipped into the air so clean and so controlled that it did not feel like it came from the same space as the laughter that had filled the room moments before. The sound was steady, warm, and impossibly precise, and it cut through the lingering noise like a line drawn across still water. And just like that, the room changed. The laughter stopped mid-breath, a phone lowered halfway, a whisper left unfinished, and the silence that followed was not forced but immediate, instinctive, as if everyone present understood without being told that something real had just begun. And Margaret opened her eyes as she continued, her voice rising with quiet strength, each note placed with care, carrying not just melody but memory, the kind that does not need explanation. And the man in the audience who had been watching her leaned forward even more, his eyes widening slightly as recognition began to surface, not fully formed but undeniable. While Jason's smile faded by degrees, the confidence in his posture loosening as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, no longer performing, no longer guiding the moment, but standing inside it without control. And as Margaret moved into the next line, her voice expanded, filling the room in a way that made the small stage feel suddenly too small, as if it could not contain what was unfolding. And the sound technician, who had been idly adjusting levels, froze with his hand hovering over the controls, afraid to touch anything, afraid to interfere with something that did not feel like it belonged to them. And in the audience, people who had been smiling now sat completely still, their expressions changing from amusement to something closer to awe. Because this was not luck. This was not a hidden hobby revealed for entertainment. This was discipline, history, something built over years that could not be faked in a moment. And Margaret did not look at Jason, did not acknowledge the crowd. She sang as if the room had disappeared, as if she were standing somewhere else entirely. Somewhere larger, somewhere that had once known her voice. And for the first time that night, no one was thinking about the joke. No one was waiting for the punchline, because it had already passed them by. replaced by something they had not expected and could not interrupt. And in that growing silence, in that steady unfolding of sound, the truth began to settle quietly over the room, that they had misjudged her, completely and without question, and that realization, more than anything else, was what held them still. Her voice did not rush, and it did not hesitate. It moved with a quiet authority that felt older than the room itself, each note landing exactly where it needed to, not for applause but for truth. And as the melody unfolded, the air seemed to grow heavier, not with tension but with presence, the kind that asks people to listen whether they intended to or not. And somewhere near the center aisle, the older man who had been watching her finally whispered a name under his breath, so softly that only the woman beside him heard it, and she turned to him with a puzzled look before glancing back at the stage, trying to reconcile the simple figure before her with whatever memory had just been spoken, while Margaret continued, her voice now expanding into something fuller, something that carried both strength and restraint at the same time. The kind of control that does not come from practice alone, but from years of understanding when to hold back and when to let go. And Jason, standing just off to the side, felt the shift more sharply than anyone, because the room was no longer responding to him. The attention he had carefully built was no longer his to guide, and for the first time that night, he did not know where to look, his eyes flickering between the audience and Margaret as if searching for a way to regain control. But there was none, because the moment had moved beyond him, and as Margaret reached a higher passage, her voice lifted effortlessly, not strained, not forced, but clear and resonant, filling every corner of the hall, and a quiet gasp escaped from somewhere in the back, followed by another, as people who had come expecting something ordinary found themselves witnessing something they could not easily explain. And the technician at the sound booth slowly lowered his hands, realizing that nothing needed to be adjusted, that what they were hearing was already exactly as it should be. And in that growing stillness, the earlier laughter felt distant, almost unreal, as if it belonged to a different night entirely. And the man who had spoken her name now sat frozen, his eyes fixed on her with a mix of disbelief and certainty, because the more she sang, the clearer it became that this was not coincidence, not a hidden hobby revealed by chance, but something far deeper, something that had once been known, perhaps even celebrated. And as Margaret moved into the final movement of the song, her expression remained calm, her posture steady, her focus inward, as though she were not performing for approval, but simply allowing something long held within her to exist again, if only for a few minutes. And in that moment, the room understood something without needing words, that they had not just underestimated her, they had overlooked an entire history standing quietly among them. And when the final note approached, it did not arrive abruptly. It unfolded, sustained with a precision that seemed to suspend time itself, holding the entire audience in a single shared breath. And when it finally resolved, it did not crash into silence, but settled gently into it, leaving behind a stillness so complete that no one moved, no one spoke. And even Jason, who had built his role on filling empty space, found himself unable to break it, because some silences are not meant to be interrupted, they are meant to be understood. For a moment after the final note faded, no one moved and no one dared to speak, the silence resting over the room like something sacred, something fragile that could shatter if touched too soon. And Margaret stood there without changing her expression, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, as if what had just happened required no acknowledgement, as if it had simply been something that needed to exist, and now did. And then somewhere near the front row, a single pair of hands came together, one clap, sharp and clear against the quiet, and it was followed by another, and then another, until the sound began to build, not rushed, not forced, but rising with a kind of certainty that spread from person to person, and within seconds the entire room was on its feet, the applause filling the hall with a force that felt completely different from the laughter that had once occupied it. This was not amusement. This was recognition. This was something earned. And the man who had whispered her name earlier was now clapping with a quiet intensity, his eyes still fixed on her, as if confirming what he already knew. And voices began to murmur again, but now they carried a different tone, words like unbelievable and incredible moving through the crowd, as phones that had once been raised to capture a joke were now capturing something else entirely, something people would later struggle to explain, and Jason remained at the edge of the stage, his hands coming together slowly, almost automatically, but his expression no longer matched the moment, because the control he had once held was gone, replaced by the unmistakable realization that he had misjudged not just a person but an entire presence. And when he finally stepped forward again, it was not with the same confidence as before, his posture slightly restrained, his voice quieter as he reached for the microphone. But before he could speak, the applause swelled again, overtaking him completely, leaving him standing there with nothing to add. Because there are moments that do not belong to the person holding the microphone. They belong to the person who changed the room, and Margaret, after a brief pause, gave a small nod, not a performance gesture, not an acknowledgement of praise, but something simple, almost private, as if she were accepting not the applause but the moment itself. And as the sound gradually softened, she stepped back from the microphone, her eyes moving across the audience for the first time, not searching, not seeking approval, but observing. And then she spoke, her voice calm, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded, saying only that she used to sing for people who listened, and the words landed with a quiet weight that settled deeper than the applause ever could, because in that single sentence she revealed more than any introduction could have. And without waiting for a response, without asking for recognition, she turned and walked toward the steps she had climbed only minutes before, leaving behind a stage that now felt different, a room that now understood something it had not before, and a man who remained standing under the lights, no longer the center of attention, no longer the one guiding the story, just someone who had witnessed the exact moment a joke became a lesson. And that night, no one remembered the laughter the same way again. The applause did not follow her off the stage so much as it trailed behind her, stretching into the aisle as if reluctant to let her go. And even as Margaret stepped down onto the wooden floor, the energy in the room remained fixed on her, heads turning, bodies shifting, people instinctively creating space as she passed, no longer seeing her as the quiet woman who had been sitting unnoticed just minutes before, but as someone they could not quite place and could not ignore. And the man who had recognized her stood halfway from his seat, his hands still, his expression caught between disbelief and confirmation, because the name he had whispered now felt undeniable, and yet he hesitated to say it aloud, as if speaking it might break something that still felt unreal. While on stage, Jason remained frozen for a second longer before forcing himself back into motion, lifting the microphone again with a voice that did not carry the same ease, thanking her, calling her performance incredible, searching for words that felt appropriate but finding none that matched what had just happened, because what he had planned as a moment of humor had transformed into something he could not frame or control, and the audience did not look to him for direction anymore, their attention drifting back toward Margaret as she reached her seat, where she paused briefly before sitting down with the same quiet composure she had shown before, her hands returning to rest gently over her handbag, as if the stage had never changed her position in the room. And yet everything around her had changed, and whispers began to move through the rows again. But now they carried recognition, fragments of memory surfacing, someone mentioning a performance years ago, another recalling a recording they had once heard, and slowly the pieces began to connect, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, quiet realizations that spread from person to person. And the man who had first recognized her finally turned to the woman beside him and said the name clearly this time, Margaret Hale, a voice that had once filled grand halls far beyond this small town, a name that had faded from public view, but not from those who had truly listened. And as that realization took hold, the room shifted again, not with noise, but with understanding, because they were no longer reacting to a surprising performance. They were confronting the fact that they had been sitting in the presence of something rare without ever noticing, and Jason, hearing the name ripple through the audience, felt the weight of it settle over him. His earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet awareness of how quickly perception can fail, and he glanced toward Margaret, who did not look back, who did not acknowledge the growing recognition, as if the need to be known had long since passed her. And in that moment, the lesson of the night did not need to be spoken aloud. It was already there in the silence between conversations, in the way people now sat a little straighter, a little more thoughtful, because sometimes it is not the performance that changes a room, it is the realization that follows it, the understanding that what we overlook often carries more depth than what we celebrate. And as the show attempted to continue, nothing felt quite the same, because the standard had shifted, and more importantly, so had the way the room was willing to see. The rest of the show continued, but it no longer carried the same weight. Each performance that followed measured not against expectation but against the quiet standard Margaret had set without trying. And even when the audience applauded, it was softer, more reflective, as if they were no longer reacting out of habit but out of thought. And throughout it all, Margaret remained seated, her posture unchanged, her attention gentle but distant, as though she were both present and somewhere far beyond the room at the same time. And people began to glance at her between acts, not openly staring but unable to ignore the pull of curiosity that had replaced their earlier indifference. And near the end of the evening, as the final performer stepped off stage and the lights shifted slightly brighter, Jason returned to the center once more, his movements more careful now, his voice measured, carrying none of the earlier playfulness that had once defined his presence. And he paused before speaking, looking out at the audience and then briefly toward Margaret, as if considering whether to acknowledge what had happened or to move past it. But some moments do not allow themselves to be dismissed, and the room itself seemed to wait, not for entertainment, but for something more honest. And finally, with a breath that was almost imperceptible, Jason spoke her name, not loudly, not theatrically, but clearly. And the sound of it moved through the audience with a quiet recognition that needed no explanation. And he asked if she would be willing to return to the stage, not as a joke this time, not as a surprise, but as someone the room now understood differently. And for a moment Margaret did not respond, her gaze resting forward, her expression unchanged, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was respectful, because now the room knew better than to rush her. And after a few seconds she stood again, slowly, with the same composed grace as before. And as she walked back toward the stage, there was no laughter, no whispering, only a quiet attentiveness that followed her every step. And when she reached the microphone, Jason stepped aside without a word, not as part of a performance, but as an acknowledgement of space that was no longer his to fill. And Margaret looked out at the audience, really looked this time, her eyes steady, taking in the faces that had once dismissed her and now waited in silence. And she did not sing immediately. She did not rush into another performance. Instead, she allowed the moment to settle, as if giving the room time to understand what it was asking for. And in that stillness there was no tension, only clarity, because the power in the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through demand, but through presence alone. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm strength as before, not raised, not dramatic, but unmistakably certain. And in that moment, everyone listening understood that what they were about to witness again was not something given lightly. It was something chosen, and that difference, quiet as it was, changed everything. Margaret did not raise her voice when she spoke, yet every word carried clearly to the far corners of the room, as if the silence itself was helping her be heard. And she said that there was a difference between being asked to perform and being invited to be understood. And the audience listened without interruption, because now they recognized the weight behind even her simplest sentences. And she allowed a small pause to follow, not for effect, but for meaning, before she gently adjusted the microphone, her fingers steady, her movements familiar in a way that suggested this stage, though small, was not foreign to her at all. And when she began again, it was not with the same song, but something softer at first, something more intimate, her voice entering the space like a quiet conversation rather than a declaration. And the room responded immediately, leaning in, every sound diminishing as people settled into a deeper kind of attention. And this time the performance did not feel like a revelation. It felt like an invitation, as though she were allowing them to step into a world they had almost missed entirely. And as the melody grew, her voice carried a different kind of emotion, not just strength, but memory, the kind that lingers in the edges of a life well lived. And the older man in the audience closed his eyes briefly, not in disbelief now, but in recognition. Because this was not just a voice he remembered, it was a presence he had once admired, something that had shaped a moment in his own past. And around him others sat just as still, their earlier assumptions replaced by a quiet respect that did not need to be announced. And Jason remained at the edge of the stage, no longer trying to reclaim attention, his posture softer, his gaze fixed on Margaret not as a host observing a performer, but as someone witnessing something he could not replicate or control. And as the song reached its center, her voice lifted again, not as dramatically as before, but with a clarity that felt even more powerful, because it was no longer about proving anything. It was simply about being, and that difference settled deeply into the room, changing the way every note was received. And when she held a sustained note, the silence around it felt intentional, almost reverent, as if the audience had learned how to listen in real time. And when the final phrase arrived, it did not seek applause. It did not push for reaction. It simply concluded, gently, with the kind of precision that leaves no doubt that nothing more needs to be added. And once again the room fell completely still, but this silence was different from the first. It was not shock, it was understanding. And when the applause finally returned, it came not as a burst, but as a wave, steady and full, rising from a place deeper than excitement. And Margaret did not bow, did not gesture for recognition. She simply stepped back slightly from the microphone, her expression calm, her presence unchanged, as if what she had given was not something extraordinary to her, but something natural, something that had always been there waiting for the right moment to be seen. And in that moment, the room no longer saw her as someone who had surprised them. They saw her as someone they had almost failed to recognize at all. The applause lingered long after the final note had settled, not fading quickly but stretching into something sustained and sincere, as if no one in the room wanted to be the first to let the moment end. And Margaret stood there quietly, not absorbing the praise but allowing it to pass through the space around her, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. And when the sound finally softened, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as acknowledgement of the crowd, but as a quiet closure to something personal, something complete. And without waiting for anything more, she stepped away from the microphone, the same way she had done before, with calm certainty, as if she had already said everything that needed to be said without ever having to explain it. And Jason, standing a few feet behind her, lowered his gaze briefly before stepping forward. But this time he did not rush to speak. He did not try to reclaim the moment, because even he understood now that the space she had created could not be filled with commentary. And when he finally did raise the microphone, his voice carried a different tone entirely, quieter, more grounded, and he simply thanked her, not as a host thanking a performer, but as someone acknowledging a lesson he had not expected to learn. And the audience listened, but their attention did not stay with him for long, because Margaret had already begun to walk off the stage again, her steps unhurried, her presence unchanged. And as she moved through the aisle, people did not just watch this time. Some nodded respectfully. Others lowered their eyes for a moment as if reflecting on their earlier assumptions. And the man who had recognized her placed a hand over his chest briefly, a gesture of quiet gratitude, not for the performance alone, but for the reminder it carried. And Margaret returned to her seat once more, sitting with the same composed stillness she had shown at the beginning of the night, as if nothing about her had shifted, even though everything around her had. And the room slowly began to settle, conversations returning in softer tones, movements more measured, because something intangible had changed in the way people were now choosing to see. And Jason remained on stage for a moment longer, looking out at the audience, then toward Margaret, and then down at the microphone in his hand, as if understanding that the role he had played earlier no longer held the same meaning. And when the lights dimmed slightly to signal the end of the evening, people did not rush to leave. They lingered, carrying with them a quiet awareness that would follow them beyond the walls of that small hall. And Margaret, after a few minutes, stood once again, gathering her handbag with the same gentle care, and she walked toward the exit without drawing attention, without seeking it, and the door closed softly behind her, leaving the room exactly as it had been physically, but entirely different in every other way. Because that night was never really about a performance. It was about recognition, about the moment when a room full of people realized how easily they had mistaken simplicity for absence, and how quietly dignity can return when given the space to be seen. And long after the lights went out and the chairs were folded away, what remained was not the memory of a joke, but the echo of a voice that had reminded them all what respect truly sounds like.